My name is Kelly Fairbairn. I am president of PPS International Limited and CEO of SyNet Americas. I had an opportunity this morning to speak with a group of business owners around talent and the talent in their organizations. And one of the underlying questions that came up in that group is, what do I do if my organization doesn't have a training or a talent development department to give support? And many of us work in organizations that do benefit from having HR departments or training departments who really help us with the development of our teams. But others of us don't have that benefit. And so I thought I could just share a few of the key points that we went over today and see if those are helpful for individuals. So just some background information. I want to share a few statistics from the 2022 LinkedIn Workplace Learning Report. And specifically, I wanted to share some information around what that report and research told us about how much individuals' job skill sets are changing. And so 25% of job skill sets have changed since 2015. So that means in the last 10 years, a quarter of the skills that we had and that we needed to be successful in our roles have changed. Now, what I think is interesting about that is you think, yeah, that's not too bad. That's only 2.5% a year, but it doesn't often happen like that, right? Our skills change when there are events in the workplace, in technology, in our markets, in our businesses that often create us having a need almost immediately or overnight for new sets of skills. You know, the examples that sit there right now that are top of mind in the past 10 years, COVID, right? Many of us were managers. We managed people in person. We did not manage people in a hybrid workforce. And so that's an example of something that's sweeping that comes through and says, now I have a need for a whole new set of skills, or at least a big chunk of skills. So 25% of our job skill sets changed since 2015, and we can expect that that's going to be something that's going to continue. The other statistic that came out of that report that I thought was really interesting as a business owner is that 24% higher income profit margins are in place for companies that provide extensive training. Well, as a small business owner, maybe you don't have the ability to do extensive training. How do we still capitalize on that connection between providing learning and getting higher profit? And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to take a look at as business owners. But even if we are in organizations that have talent development and training departments, that just tells us I need to pay attention. I need to use those resources that are available because it does help the bottom line. The other statistic that popped up in there was around retention. 94% of employees in those surveys said that they were likely to stay at a company longer if that company invested in their career development. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise. People want to continue to learn and grow. So knowing that, if you're in an organization that doesn't have a training department that you can go to get this kind of support, what are some of the challenges that you face and what are some practical things you can do? So 3 things that we often see when this is the case. It's a challenge to know, what in the world am I supposed to develop? How do I know what to develop? And if I can't develop everything, how do I really hone in on those things that are important for people to know? The other challenge that we often see, and this is whether you have a training department or not, finding the time to develop your staff and your team can be difficult. We all have full plates to be able to do that, and to pull somebody out of role to be able to develop them isn't always practical. And then the last is having developmental actions. How do I find those things, whether it be training, whether it be them going to networking events or conferences, whether it's doing some things on the job? How do I find developmental options? So I'm going to share with you just some very practical ways that we can think about handling these challenges when we are the training department. So let's talk about knowing what to develop. You need to know your subject. And by that, it's really twofold. You need to know what does it take to be successful in that particular role, and then what does that individual need who's in that role, because not everybody is the same. Some of the advice that I give around this is when you're thinking about a particular role, what are some of the things that end up being stumbling blocks, problems that maybe pop up again and again? Those can give you some cues to this is an important skill for us to have. And so an example that I like to share is in our organization, we have program coordinators. We know for a program coordinator, that role means that you have to be very sensitive to deadlines. You need to have an understanding of project management, but you have to be sensitive to deadlines. And it's not just sensitive to deadlines. We looked at what are the places where we really get hung up? Where does that get in the way? And so one of the things that we discovered is that individuals in roles are more successful, not only to have a sensitivity to deadline, but that when they run into a situation where the deadline isn't going to be met, that they can come up with options that they control or influence that move that deadline forward. And so that's a little bit about knowing the role. What does success look like in that role, and what does it take to do that? The second thing, though, is I need to also know what is important for this person in this role. You could have somebody who's been in a role for a decade, 25 years, long-term tenured individuals, and there's something changes in the role, and now that means that they have to have different skills. And so we're always want to be looking where do we need individuals to be from a role perspective, and then what does this individual have? And sometimes that gap is big, sometimes that gap is small, but it's really matching up and observing, watching individuals, taking a look at their work output, having conversations with them about what they find challenging. These are ways that we can get to know, what an individual's development should be in relationship to the job that they're in. So those are just some practical ways for us to think about when I don't have training support. How do I take that time to really know what it is that I should be developing? Now, the other challenge is around having time. And time is such a critical resource for us in any business, but certainly when we're in a smaller business that doesn't have support of a training department. We don't have a lot of time for ourselves to either spend one-on-one with people or to pull people out and send them to external programs, conferences, things like that. So this will not come as a surprise. But I think sometimes we try to do too much. And so one of the things I would recommend is focus on one thing at a time. You do not need to tackle every development need that an individual has. There are some things that we use as training professionals. We often look at what does it take to be successful in the role? How frequently would you use that skill in the role? How challenging is it to learn that skill? Is it tough? Is it something that you can learn fairly easily with just a procedure guide, maybe a job aid, a skill card? Or is it something that really requires a lot more to learn and be able to do it successfully? And then the last thing that we look at is, sometimes we call it entry behavior. That's a fancy way of saying, what do people come in already knowing about that topic? And so if I have something that's critical to the role and it's used frequently, it's tough to learn, and people don't come in knowing it, that probably is an area that I want to focus on. And so that can help me to prioritize when I'm looking at a bevy of things that I could have individuals focus on. What are those things? I'm going to start with those things that have the most return on investment. So that'll help you with time. And the last thing that's a big challenge for us is, how do I find development opportunities? Well, one of the best development opportunities that's out there is really letting people learn from their experiences. This will help you both with time, and it helps you with finding and matching up the development opportunity with the skill that people need to learn. And so we don't think this is leveraged enough. And you might think, well, why would an organization like ours that focuses on global leadership development and global development really encourage us to use experiences, for instance, with debriefing as a primary learning mode? Well, experience is an excellent teacher. We remember it longer. We're able to apply it. It's a very practical thing to use. Where I think that we often miss the mark is we might think enough, oh, this individual needs this particular skill. I'm going to assign them to this project. I'm going to delegate this to them so that they get that exposure. And we let them do it, but we never tell them that part of why we're doing that is so that they can develop X, Y, or Z. And we don't come in after the fact and ask them, what did they learn? How was that important? And so when you can not only identify and experience a project, real life work that's going on to use as a learning tool, I want to start by telling people, this is why I'm having you do this. This is going to help you learn this. It's going to give you exposure to a part of the business that you've not seen before. And when you've finished with this project or had this experience, I want to spend just a little bit of time with you asking you about, how did it go? What did you learn? What things were challenging? What was easy? And most importantly, if you're in this the next time, what are you going to focus on the next time? And so those are just some things that we had a longer form discussion about this morning, but I think those are helpful things for us to think about if we don't have access to a training and development department, or even if we do have access to those professionals, for us as leaders to help develop when we may be unsure of what individuals need. We may be crunched for time or resources, and we may not know, should I send somebody to a training department, or are there other options that are out there? Thanks so much. If we can be of help, please reach out.